Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Subhanaka la ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana innaka antal alimul hakim. Wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billahi al-aliyyil azim. Allahumma inna na'udhu bika min fitnati mahya wa mamat. Wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billahi al-aliyyil azim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and good day through this recording to you. I am sorry that I am unable to be there in person for this particular conference, a very important conference that allows us to be able to understand the dynamics that in fact is existent in relation to matters relating to radicalization and terrorism, and how we as a Muslim community must take responsibility, leadership, advocacy, and as well as to be able to rely on hard data that allows us to understand what in fact is happening within the Australian context, rather than relying on, for example, international statistics, although they also help us a lot in understanding the various dynamics that the issue of terrorism and radicalization in fact causes. In this particular quick recording that I have done for the actual conference itself, I wanted to speak about my personal experience in visiting some of the camps within the southern Turkish borders, housing the displaced Syrians who in fact are over there based as refugees. It is quite interesting that when I met the foreign minister, Professor Ahmed Davutoglu, and he mentioned that they in fact do not speak about the Syrian people, who are very noble people, to be referred to as refugees, but in fact referred to as duyuf, as guests of Turkey. And I think this is a very important sentiment, as well as consciousness that the Turkish government itself is portraying of whom they're looking after, because the internally displaced people of Syria who are caught in a battle essentially between factions who themselves are looking for a power, particularly a power vacuum that may arise from the failure of and the fall of the tyranny and the oppression of the government of Bashar Assad. And it's long time coming that dictators like Assad are in fact removed. But the problem is that in fact these factional groups that in fact are dealing with the conflict are placing an incredible amount of oppressive pressure, difficulty and calamity upon the innocent Syrian people. So my experience was to actually speak with the citizens of Syria, who had no choice to in fact flee from Syria and find refuge as guests of Turkey, for example, in southern Turkey. And I specifically spent some time in a region called Gaziantep, and the city that in fact I spent most of my time is in Gaziantep and Kilis, which is just north of the border from Aleppo, and approximately 20 or 30 kilometers from there. I have also taken the time to in fact send a PDF document to the organizers of the conference, and inshallah I hope that you are able to get a copy of this printed by the conference organizers, which really is a written expose of this particular discussion we are having here in relation to Syria, and my experience of meeting with the internally displaced people of Syria as guests of southern Turkey. My time in Gaziantep is very relevant to the Australian context, which I'm going to return to a little bit later, in regards to some of the Australians who in fact have gone across to southern Turkey and potentially into Syria as fighters. And I think one of the conversations that needs to happen in Australia is the concept of the foreign fighter that is affecting a number of families and Muslims, without a doubt, as Muslim Australians here in Australia. That whilst we as a Muslim community, a global Muslim community, have an unconditional love and support for all Syrians, we also must recognize the priorities of how we show that love, show that care, and advocate on their behalf in a manner which brings about a positive, a constructive solution to these people. Because right now, this is not happening. And we know that there are forces from both sides, and essentially multiple of sides, and I don't want to make any political statements about the foreign powers of United States of America, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and all of these powers which are in fact not fueling the conflict, but literally creating an explosive situation that we are seeing the hundreds of thousands of deaths and fatalities and injuries that in fact are right throughout Syria. What I am more concerned about, that despite the fact that our religion, Islam, tells us about the importance of ethical processes in taking action that brings about changes in conflict zones, we are having people who are individuals and in many cases not well educated and informed about, first and foremost, the actual conflict, and secondly, obviously, from the very framework they're actually acting, and that is Islam, and ultimately, in fact, going into Syria and putting themselves in danger, and in fact, breaking the laws that surround this matter, and thirdly, are in fact breaking serious levels of Islamic ethics that this is concerned. And we as religious leaders throughout Australia have a responsibility to, number one, have no difficulty in making it clear that the Australian government's policies against what is happening in Syria is not only defective, but also something which is politically biased and highly questionable in relation to their relationship to the Muslims of the world. That is something that we should, as leaders, not forget about and have the capacity to be able to stand and speak about and advocate for. And secondly, that in fact, having said that, we as Muslims, as individuals and communities, have a responsibility to in fact act in an ethical manner. That despite the wrong of others, we can't do wrong. That two wrongs do not make a right, and us doing wrong is actually doubly wrong. And this is a serious problem that we as religious leaders need to address in our sermons, as well as in our educational centers, and without a doubt in our advocacy at the mainstream level of Australia. And thirdly, it is very important for us not to forget that we have a responsibility for humanitarian aid to the innocent people of Syria, and that this humanitarian aid is not going to be exploited, manipulated, and misused in order to fund the factional militia within Syria. That in fact, in the name of humanitarian aid, in the name of collecting charity, that these monies are not actually funneled to militia in Syria, because that particular group's bias is, say, for example, towards Jabhat al-Nusra, for example, or any of the other militant organizations in some of the cases which are actually doing grave danger and grave harm and grave disservice to the people of Syria in the name of Islam and in the name of removing the tyranny and deserved removal of the tyranny of Bashar al-Assad. That the tyrannical factional groups make no call for the benefit of, for the safety of, and for the protection of the Syrian people per se. That does not mean that every group over there is somehow factionally and politically motivated. My meeting with the people, in fact, has been very clear that, in fact, there are a number of very ethical groups within Syria, and largely, in fact, operated by Syrian nationals themselves rather than foreign fighters who are, in fact, providing large levels of, significant levels of, hopefully, protection and service to the people of Syria. And so in this regard of humanitarian aid, we also as religious leaders and community leaders have a responsibility to make it clear first and foremost to our own communities, and secondly also to actually have a policy that we will not support the wrong funneling of, corrupt funneling of, and misuse and exploitation of the funds collected by the innocent, well-intentioned Australians, and indeed Australian Muslims, who are very well-intentioned and who are wanting to provide support to the people of Syria, that these monies are going to be ultimately be used by highly dubious groups that in fact are fueling the conflicts in Syria. The very thing I wanted to talk to you about is my own experience with the people in southern Turkey, who were displaced people from Syria, and I happened to interview 486 people and ask them a very similar set of questions, and I would like to go through some of those and share with you what the people of Syria are actually saying that we have to give voice to, that we have to listen to, that if we are going to in any way assert and claim that we are going to be speaking for the benefit of the Syrian people, and at the same time to hopefully work to eliminate the conflict that is killing thousands and thousands of Syrians, that we need to also understand what the Syrian people want, what their own aspirations are, and how they see the start of the conflict, the middle of the conflict, and the end of this conflict. And first and foremost, I wanted to read from my PDF itself one or two stories in order to, I suppose, give a kind of a semblance of an understanding of how these people in these camps shared their stories, that they were very candid, and some of these stories are very telling and deeply troubling. So here's one of the ones, if I can read this to you. Thank you very much for that. This is about the story of a man who initially joined actually the protests in 2011, against Assad himself, before it turned out into an all-out war where different factions were in fact even killing the residents of Syrians because they themselves were more attuned to a civil protest than a bloody war. So when the killing started, this gentleman's younger brother stayed behind, and he was left with the responsibility of his own family of 5 people, and as well as his young brother's family of 3. So he himself looked after a group of around about 8 or 9 people, and his younger brother stayed back and joined the local forces in actually providing protection for the people of Syria. His wife and his brother's wife played an equal part in escaping from their hometown. So it's important to see and acknowledge the work of women who are actively involved in protecting their family, as well as holding the community and the society together as much as it can be, in terms of the fleeing of the families, as well as when they actually enter into a displaced camp as a family together. So they escaped from their hometown, make it into the borders of Turkey, and finally given access into the camp. The total journey for them took a week, filled with extreme fear, and these are the words they have used themselves to explain to me: lack of water throughout the journey and hope for survival. His sister-in-law, the gentleman who is taking the family outside of Syria, was nearly raped en route. So his sister-in-law was actually nearly raped en route. So he bargained with a foreign fighter. So this was a foreign fighter who was fighting against Assad, was prepared to rape his sister-in-law, and keeping in mind here, if he is fighting against Assad, the imagery is he must be supporting the Syrian people. But this is not true. That largely, in fact, the factional fighting is about power at the expense of the Syrian people. And I know this is not the case with every fighter, that they're out there raping and pillaging. But it tells you the story that we have to be careful that simply because some group is anti-Assad does not necessarily mean that they're actually pro-Syrian people. And this is a common problem that is existent right at the heart of this entire conflict, that is missing in the equation of our discourse and our conversation, which we need to understand, and primarily fueled by foreign fighters. he was fighting this Assad regime, and he actually held this family at gunpoint by, and the only way he could in fact save his sister-in-law is to give his entire set of cash that he had and give it to him. So the anti-Assad fighter basically threatened them, either give me your wealth or I will rape one of your women. And so he decided to obviously give the money. And in giving the money, he said that I did not bargain for a broken tooth, but I got one. So the fighter actually jabbed him with the butt of the rifle and obviously broke his tooth. But he got it anyway at the instant of handing over the money. And his brother-in-law, his brother, the sister-in-law that is with him, her husband, in other words, the brother who is escaping, is now actually dead, killed by the Syrian army within the first 3 months of the war breaking out. So this particular family, a native-born Syrian family, has experienced, and it's common, this is not a one-off story, has experienced conflict, harm, danger, and life-threatening situation, both from, in one case obviously dead brother, from the Assad regime, the tyrannical Assad regime, and secondly from the fighters, the foreign fighters who are claiming to actually fight the Assad regime and actually receiving funding and receiving support from international sources. And we need to be cognizant of this, aware of this, as to how we are going to move forward in actually helping the people of Syria. I don't want to take too much of your time over here. You have live speakers over there, but I do want to share with you some particular statistics in relation to some of the questions I had asked of the people in these camps. As I had mentioned, this in fact is available in the actual PDF that I'm hoping that the organizers can actually print it out and share with you, because all of these statistics in fact and all this information is referenced in the actual report. So first and foremost, of the 486 people that in fact I interviewed in southern Turkey, in Kilis and surrounding areas of Kilis and Gaziantep, all of them being people who are native to Syria, 64% of them were males and 36% were females that I in fact spoke to. And I asked them the following questions. The first one was, do you support the removal of Bashar al-Assad and his regime? 100%, 486 out of 486 said yes. There was not a single person in these displaced camps that in fact disagreed with me in that regard. Second question was, in order of importance, why do you want Bashar al-Assad and his regime removed? So what was their reason for Bashar al-Assad to be removed? I will go by a diminishing order here. 44% of them said freedom and liberty. 37% of them said better economic opportunity for everyone. 15% of them said alleviate poverty and suffering. 4% only said to establish a Sunni government, and 0% said to establish an anti-Shia government. The conflict does not appear to have any religious motivation in the minds of the native displaced Syrians, and is in contrast to the assertions of numerous fighting forces that exist within Syria, the rebel groups, etc., which is then projected into the international community and without a doubt within the Australian context. The second question was, do you support the current mode of conflict, that is, violence, as a means to achieve your expectations? Do you support the current mode of conflict in terms of war and violence? Do you support that? 100% of them said no. Whilst this is a reflection of the displaced Syrians, they often commented that many of those Syrians fighting alongside the complex mix of rebel groups are doing so to establish safety against both the regime and the rebel groups themselves, and hope to return political authority to locals and not to foreign forces at all, whether Muslim or non-Muslim. And then my next question was, what is your preferred method that should be used to bring the necessary political change in Syria? In other words, yes, the conflict is happening. You want Bashar al-Assad removed. What were their thoughts as to how they should actually go about? 42% of them said civil protests and disobedience. And many of these people that I in fact interviewed, males and females, were involved in the initial civil disobedience and protests. 31% said international political pressure. 19% said internal armed struggle. 7% said external foreign army. And only 1% said external foreign jihadist groups. Those seeking political, diplomatic, and civil means to bring political change in Syria were the most significant of this entire group. They were seeking diplomatic, civic, as well as civil disobedience methods to in fact bring about change in Syria. They only differed between internal and external involvement of interference. They all, or significantly largely, opposed any kind of foreign interference and intervention of force, and in fact blamed violence upon the international and foreign interference, both from governments as well as from rebel groups. I think it's very important for us to actually note that as a very clear sign of what the people of Syria are saying. I then asked them, which statement best describes jihadists, because they use the term themselves as jihadi, currently in Syria for you? In other words, if I was to say that this group is a jihadi, in other words, they are people who are apparently struggling for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, 61% of them said that these jihadists are actually nothing more, 61% of them, that they're nothing more than those fighting for their own political opportunity. That they did not see them fighting for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. 25% of those said that they are simply exploiting and being exploited by political opportunists, and they mentioned countries. So they mentioned Iran or Saudi Arabia and entities that in fact are connected to these states that are funding and supporting the so-called jihadist groups in order to actually come and fight there for their own ends and purposes. Only 9% said that the jihadists, the jihadi people of the Syrian war, only 9% of them said that they are actually fighting for the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in bringing about justice and removing an unjust oppressor for the goodness of the people of Syria. 5% said they were not sure who was a jihadist and who wasn't a jihadist, because it was such a blurred conflict, and these were the people of Syria themselves. The vast majority of the displaced Syrian people considered the claim of jihad by the foreign fighters and the groups they supported as one form or another of political opportunism, whether by themselves or by other de facto powers, including state powers, exploiting them in this regard. It's very unfortunate that this is the reality they see, and I think in many ways quite relevantly true in what we see in this regard. My next question was, do you see the removal of Bashar al-Assad and his regime as the equivalent of necessary political change in Syria? In other words, is the removal of Bashar al-Assad the critical necessary change required in Syria? You would not believe 54% of them said no. That 42% said yes, and 4% said not sure. In other words, 54% of them said that it's not so much the removal of Assad as much as it is to actually bring about freedom, liberty, equality, and equitable rights, etc. into the society, whoever was able to do so. The people were clearly divided, 54% to 42%, and it seemed that most people agreed that the removal of Assad was actually needed. That even those who said no, it's not necessary in the equation, they believed it is the only thing that will bring about change, which I think is a very realistic answer to my question. My next question was, how do you view Iran as a regional power? 97% of Syrians said unfavorably, that they did not see Iran as a favorable power in the region. Only 2% of them said that it was favorable for Syria, and 1% said that in fact they were not sure. I then asked them, how do you view USA, the United States of America, as a power involved in the region? 95%, similar amount of number of people said unfavorably. They did not support the intervention or the exploitative powers that the United States of America would be using in Syria as we speak. 95% of them were unfavorable to this, and only 5% said that it was favorable, and they connected this to that in fact that this will actually bring about humanitarian aid if the United States was involved. So then I asked them, what kind of support should the international community provide for the Syrian people? 57% said economic aid, 38% said humanitarian aid, 4% said weapons to fight, and 1% said do nothing or actually were not sure in this regard. I then asked them, because I was in southern Turkey, what is your opinion regarding the support they were getting from the Turkish government to date? 74% were extremely happy, 24% were satisfied, 6% of them said it could be better, and 0%, none of them were in any way disappointed. So the displaced Syrians were overwhelmingly appreciative of the support of Turkey as a place where refugees could actually go to in providing the camps in the manner that the government and the volunteers and the non-governmental organizations treated and assisted them. I think this is also a point that we should use in advocating for the treatment of refugees within Australia. That we have a current situation right here in Australia that we can learn from countries like Turkey as to how, as well as, for example, cities like Toronto in Canada, where in fact there is a very different experience of refugees who are fleeing from war zones, and the current Australian government's treatment of refugees is something that must be rejected, that's something that must be spoken against, and we need to advocate to the government to in fact adopt better policies that is not only humanitarian and humane, but also within the ethos of what it means to be Australians. We are people of diversity, and we are people who do not take sides in political conflicts in a manner which is totally unethical. Australians have never been known, and Australia has not been known to be an unethical government until late. And we need to change this in light of what we see other governments are able to do towards the refugees of war zones and conflicts. I also asked them if they were involved in the initial protests in 2011 in Syria. 67% of them were, and 33% were not. Those are the statistics, and I know my time is coming to an end over here in terms of the presentation I wanted to give you. I would like you to take a copy of the PDF, because in the actual report I speak specifically about a very troubling Australian experience of the story in southern Turkey of how Australian foreigners who are actually arriving in Turkey looking to enter into Syria, and there actually is a number of this actually happening. And to sum that particular situation up, you would not believe that in fact the Australian Muslims are seen in a very negative light by the southern Turkey community, who are very supportive of the people of Syria and also against Bashar al-Assad. And I would ask you to actually read the paper to actually get a better picture of what my experience was in seeing how, unfortunately, Australian Muslims were seen in such a negative light. I really hope that what I have shared here briefly sheds light on the Syrian situation, and secondly also in the Australian context of how we are actually in a situation where we need to understand that if we do not advocate in the right and ethical manner, we have a large portion of highly impressionable youth who may get the wrong message about what the Syrian conflict is all about, and how, firstly as Muslims, and without a doubt as Australian Muslims, that we have a responsibility to be people of ethical, constructive, and without a doubt, people of firmness with compassion of how we're going to deal with this juggernaut of a problem that Syria has become. I really hope that you will benefit from the entire conference. And again, thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.